Hi everyone, my name is Corey, and this is my digital presentation on this week's reading, The Song of the Non-Aligned World by Akhil Gupta. So let's start off with Akhil Gupta's thesis on page 63. At the beginning of the article, where it reads, this article problematizes nationalism by juxtaposing it and other forms of spatial commitment um, and identity, particularly transnational ones. In doing so, it seeks to illuminate the specificity of nationalism in the post-colonial world. So this statement here, I think, is a thesis statement because it sets up the central argument of Gupta's passage, where he argues that nationalism is not a natural phenomenon because it has to be understood within the context of transnational identities and global economic processes such as trade, migration, and other forms of globalization such as technology. Nationalism is constructed and is a part of our transnational identities, which we will examine further in this presentation. So, the non-aligned movement, NAM, is transnational. To support this thesis, let's examine three pieces of evidence, starting off on page 65, where Gupta writes, the non-aligned movement serves as a good example of transnational imagined community. The non-aligned movement demonstrates parallel to deterritorialization, equally important, although less noted, processes that are involved in the repartitioning and reterritorialization of space. So NAM, short for non-aligned movement, is a coalition of countries that came together during the Cold War. They came together because they didn't want to pick sides between the United States and the Soviet Union. Instead, they came together to form a collective identity that went beyond state lines and borders. It is the movement like NAM that challenged the assumption that spatial belonging is within the confines of a nation or the borders of a nation. Alternative spatial commitments like NAM demonstrate and proves how nationalism is not a natural phenomenon, but it's constructed. So moving on to page 71, uh, Gupta further explains on the idea that nationalism is constructed by explaining that it relies on global institutions. So here, where it reads, the independence of third world countries, dependent as it is on the international order of the United Nations, thus redirects spatial identity from the nation at the same time that it produces it. So the very idea of a nation exists because of global structures like the UN, which plays a role in defining and recognizing statehood on a more broader and international scale. These systems contradict the idea that nationalism is organic, which reveals that many third world countries often face pressure, oh, shoot, my bad, to align with one side in a polarizing binary world, specifically in the context of the Cold War. The evidence demonstrates that nationalism is created when reviewed in a larger, broader global context. So finally, on page 70, where it reads, the rapid geographical expansion of the largest capitalistic combines of the world system have put third world countries who are producers of raw material and sellers of inexpensive labor power under greater and greater competitive pressure vis-a-vis each other. So here, Gupta makes the argument that nationalism has ties to economics and economic structures. Um, Nationalism is shaped by the pressures of capitalism. So, as stated before, third world countries are often pressured to align with one another, to pick a side between the capitalistic West and the communistic East. This created economic competition between nations, and it forced countries to choose sides in a binary world, thus creating NAM, which emerged as a response of the economic and political landscape rejecting superpowers and promoting cooperation. This demonstrates how nationalism has roots in economic structures and that it plays a role in how we view and shape spaces and identities. For example, immigrants. So Gupta discusses how economic structures shape how we understand nationalism, but I think it's also important to point out that nationalism also defines those who belong. So here it is where I picked out the quote that stood out to me. on page 73, where it reads, "The nation is continually represented in state institutions such as courts, schools, bureaucracies, and museums, which employ the icons of symbols of the nation, flags, currencies, seals, etc." But very important, the nation is also constituted by a state's external dealings with other states, who recognize these practices as belonging to an entity, excuse me, as belonging to an entity of the same kind as themselves, thereby validating the ideology of nationalism. So Gupta here is making the argument that institutions reinforce a shared national identity. And to validate these said national identities, a nation also needs to be validated by other nations as well to be recognized as a state. So the way I understood this passage is that it creates the idea that a nation is unified, inclusive, and natural. And you can be part of said nation so long as you abide by its standards, ideals, ideologies, therefore creating nationalism. But it often alienates immigrants who come to a new nation and therefore makes them be perceived as foreign simply because they're coming to this new nation with a new or like a pre-existing sense of nationalism from their previous country. So this rolls down to my own experience growing up here in America. So when I was little, uh, I went to grade school 1 through 5 in a private school in China. Reflecting on it now, there's a strong sense of Chinese national pride. So I was taught a lot about their history, their culture, and why China is a great country. Uh, it reinforced a clear sense of identity and a sense of belonging. Schools, as Gupta noted in this passage, are a key institution that construct and reinforce nationalism. So when I moved to the US to be with most of my family, and to go to middle school, I entered a new nationalistic framework, one that didn't incorporate me. American institutions, such as schools, also reinforce nationalism through symbols and narratives and their history that they tell. And it shapes those who are truly seen as American. So when I came to the United States, I was bullied a lot just because I seemed and appeared fresh off the boat. I was bullied because I was given the stereotypical minority myths, such as, oh, go to him because he's smart, or always called banana growing up as a kid, or, and I was always given this something called like a Chinese middle finger. It's basically where uh, they would give you like the pinky finger, and then I would be always asked, oh, isn't this how you like, how you would always like, isn't this how you give the middle finger in China? And then they would just point at me nonstop. Um, and it showed me that my identity was nothing more than a joke. So this reflects Gupta's argument that nationalism is not about internal symbols like flags and schools. It's about how nations define themselves in relation to outsiders. So in the US, I was perceived as foreign or fob, fresh off the boat, however you want to call it. And not because of my background, but because of American nationalism. Like all other nationalisms, whether it be if I was in China or whether I'm in America, it constructed the idea of who's an insider and who's an outsider. While American nationalism promotes these ideals of inclusivity, in reality, I didn't experience any of that growing up. And it made me feel foreign. It made me feel alien. It made me feel like I truly didn't belong until I came to terms with it later on. Well, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you have a good day.